At my father's funeral, my stepmother publicly disinherited me. The next day she kicked me out. I was standing beside my father's casket when my stepmother did the unthinkable. The chapel was packed with mourners, people who'd known my dad for decades, colleagues, friends, distant relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. I was 28 years old, and I'd just lost the only parent I had left, the man who'd raised me alone for the first 12 years of my life before she came into the picture. The priest had just finished the eulogy, was asking if anyone wanted to say a few words, and that's when Linda stood up in the front row, smoothed down her black Chanel dress, and turned to face the crowd with the expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. Cold, calculated, cruel. "It's before we continue," she said, her voice cutting through the somber atmosphere like a knife. "I need to make something very clear to everyone here." I felt my stomach drop because I knew that tone, knew that look, knew that whatever was coming next was going to hurt. She turned slightly, her eyes finding mine across the small distance between us, and I saw something flicker in them that almost looked like satisfaction. My late husband's will has been read," she continued, projecting her voice so everyone could hear perfectly. "And I think it's important that everyone here understands the situation clearly. Michael," she gestured toward me dismissively, like I was a stranger and not the son who'd sat at my father's bedside for 3 straight days while he died of cancer, "has been provided for adequately in his father's estate. However, the house, the business, the investments, everything of real value has been left to me." The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt every eye in that chapel turn toward me, measuring my reaction, wondering if this was appropriate, if they should say something. But that wasn't even the worst part. Linda wasn't done, wasn't satisfied with just publicly announcing my disinheritance at my own father's funeral. "I know some of you might have expectations," she said, her voice taking on this false sympathetic tone that made my skin crawl. "But my husband and I discussed this extensively before his passing. Michael is an adult now, perfectly capable of supporting himself. The estate will be used to honor my husband's memory in ways he would have wanted, through the foundation I'll be establishing in his name." She said it like she was being generous, like she was doing the world a favor, and I stood there frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to believe that she would choose this moment, this place, to do this to me. My Aunt Karen, my dad's sister, started to stand up from her seat, her face red with anger, but I caught her eye and shook my head slightly. Not here, not now, not at his funeral. The service continued in a blur after that, people offering me condolences that felt hollow now, their eyes filled with pity or curiosity or judgment. Some of them probably thought my dad had good reasons for leaving me out, that there was more to the story than they knew. Others looked uncomfortable, like they'd witnessed something inappropriate but didn't want to get involved. I went through the motions, shook hands, accepted hugs, stood by while they lowered my father into the ground. And the whole time Linda was there, playing the grieving widow perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting sympathy from people who had no idea what kind of person she really was. When it was finally over, when the last mourner had left the cemetery, she walked past me without a word, got into the black Mercedes that had been my father's, and drove away. I stood there alone in the fading light, staring at the fresh grave, and wondered how everything had gone so completely, devastatingly wrong. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom to find Linda standing in the doorway with 2 large suitcases. "Pack your things," she said. No greeting, no pretense of civility now that there was no audience to perform for. "You have until noon to be out of this house." I sat up, my mind still foggy from the sleeping pill I'd taken the night before, the only way I'd been able to shut off my brain after everything. "Linda, we need to talk about this," I started, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. There's nothing to talk about. This is my house now, and I don't want you here. You have 4 hours. She dropped the suitcases on the floor with a loud thud and walked away, leaving me sitting there in my childhood bed, in the room where my dad used to read me stories, where I'd done homework and played video games and grown up, and I realized that she was serious. She was actually kicking me out the day after my father's funeral. I started packing mechanically, pulling clothes from drawers, books from shelves, photographs from walls. Everything I owned fit into those 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes, which was depressing in its own way, evidence of how little I'd accumulated in 28 years. I'd been living at home to help take care of my dad during his illness, had put my own life on hold for the last 18 months to be there for him, and this was my reward. As I packed, I kept thinking about how we'd gotten here, how the woman who was throwing me out had once pretended to care about me, had played the role of concerned stepmother just convincingly enough to fool my dying father. I thought about all the years of small cruelties, the undermining comments, the way she'd slowly isolated my dad from his family and friends, the manipulation that I'd seen but couldn't prove, couldn't fight against without looking like I was the problem. My phone rang as I was taping up the last box, and I saw it was my Aunt Karen. "I'm coming to get you," she said before I could even say hello. "Don't argue with me, Michael. You're not staying in a hotel. You're coming to our place until you figure things out." I felt something crack in my chest at her words, the kindness cutting through my numbness in a way that actually hurt. "Karen, I can't—" I started, but she interrupted me just like Linda had, except her interruption came from a place of love. "Yes, you can, and you will. Your uncle and I have the guest room ready. We should have insisted on this yesterday after what that woman did, but we thought you needed space. Clearly, we were wrong." I agreed because I didn't have the energy to argue, didn't have anywhere else to go, and honestly, I needed family right now more than I needed pride. But let me back up, because you need to understand how I ended up in this situation. You need to understand what Linda really was, what she'd been doing for the last 16 years, and why my father, a smart man, a careful man, had been completely blind to it. My mother died when I was 12 years old. Sudden heart failure that nobody saw coming. One day she was fine, laughing at dinner, helping me with my science project, and the next day she was gone. My dad fell apart, and I don't blame him for that. He loved her completely, and losing her destroyed something fundamental in him. For 2 years, we stumbled through life together, 2 people who didn't know how to function without the woman who'd held everything together. He threw himself into work, and I threw myself into school, and we existed in this quiet grief that we never really talked about. Linda appeared when I was 14, met my dad at some business conference where she was working as an event coordinator. She was beautiful, charming, attentive, everything a lonely widower might fall for. She listened to him talk about my mom, something most women wouldn't tolerate, and she seemed genuinely interested in me, asked about school and hobbies, and made an effort to connect. I wanted to hate her on principle, wanted to stay loyal to my mum's memory, but she made it hard. She brought little gifts when she visited, remembered things I mentioned in passing, acted like she genuinely cared about becoming part of our family. My dad started smiling again, started looking forward to things, and I told myself that was what mattered, that my mom would want him to be happy. They got married less than a year after they met, and that's when things started to change. Nothing dramatic at first, just small shifts that I noticed but couldn't articulate. She started redecorating the house, removing my mom's touches piece by piece, replacing them with her own aesthetic. When I protested about taking down my mom's paintings, Linda sat me down with this concerned expression and explained that my dad needed to move forward, that keeping shrines to the past wasn't healthy. She made it sound so reasonable that I felt guilty for objecting. She started planning dinners and events that somehow never worked with Aunt Karen's schedule, coincidences that meant my dad saw less and less of his sister. She took over managing the household finances, said she was helping my dad because he was so busy with work, and he seemed grateful for it. By the time I was 16, Linda had effectively isolated my dad from most of his old life. His friends stopped coming around because Linda always had some excuse for why it wasn't a good time, some event or renovation or illness that made entertaining impossible. Family dinners became less frequent, then rare, then practically non-existent. And with me, she was more subtle, playing the loving stepmother in front of my dad while finding ways to undermine me when we were alone. "Your father is so stressed about money," she'd say casually. "Maybe we should talk about whether that expensive college you want is really necessary. Or, I know you think you're helping by doing the dishes, but you never do them the way your father likes. Maybe just let me handle it." Little comments designed to make me feel like a burden, like I was causing problems by existing. When I graduated high school, I'd planned to go to Stanford, had gotten accepted with a partial scholarship, was so excited to finally get out and start my own life. But Linda sat my dad down and convinced him that I should stay local, go to the state university, live at home to save money. "We need to be smart about finances," she told him, showing him spreadsheets and projections that somehow made it look like we couldn't afford for me to go away. I found out years later that my mom had left me a college fund, $50,000, that was supposed to be untouchable, earmarked specifically for my education. Linda had convinced my dad to invest it more aggressively, and somehow it had ended up absorbed into their general accounts. When I confronted her about it, she looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "Your father made that decision. Are you calling him irresponsible? After everything he's done for you?" So I went to state, lived at home, commuted to classes while working part-time at a bookstore to cover my expenses, because I didn't want to ask my dad for money. Didn't want to give Linda more ammunition about what a burden I was. I watched her slowly take over every aspect of my father's life, saw her manipulate and control and isolate, but I couldn't prove anything. She was too smart, too careful, always had plausible explanations, always played the devoted wife when anyone was watching. My dad seemed happy, or at least content, and who was I to tell him that his wife was slowly destroying his relationship with everyone who'd ever cared about him? I tried once, during my junior year, sat him down and tried to explain what I was seeing. He looked at me with such disappointment, such hurt, and said, "Michael, I know you miss your mum. I do too. But Linda is my wife, and she's been nothing but good to us. I need you to make an effort here." After that, I stopped trying. I focused on finishing school, on building my own life separate from the toxicity at home. I got a job after graduation working for a small marketing firm, rented a tiny apartment across town, and saw my dad maybe once a week for dinner. Linda was always there, of course, monitoring our conversations, steering topics away from anything she didn't want discussed. But at least I had my own space, my own life, even if it meant seeing less of my dad than I wanted. Then, 3 years ago, my dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, already metastasized, prognosis measured in months, not years. I moved back home immediately, quit my job, because nothing mattered except being there for him, making whatever time he had left as good as possible. Linda played the devastated wife beautifully, crying at doctor appointments, holding my dad's hand, talking about fighting this together. But behind closed doors, she was different. She controlled his medication schedule, decided who could visit and when, managed every aspect of his care with an iron fist disguised as concern. I was there constantly, and she couldn't hide everything from me. couldn't completely control the narrative when I was sleeping in the next room and spending every waking hour at my dad's side. I saw how she'd forget to give him pain medication on time, saw how she'd schedule visitors for times when he was most exhausted, saw the small cruelties that she could pass off as mistakes or oversight. I tried to talk to the doctors, to the nurses, but she was his wife, had medical power of attorney, and I was just the son who they probably thought was stressed and paranoid. The last 6 months were the worst. My dad deteriorated rapidly, went from bad to terrible to barely conscious, and I watched him slip away while Linda planned her future. She'd be on the phone in the next room talking to lawyers, to financial advisors, making arrangements while my dad lay dying 20 feet away. I'd hear her discussing investments, property transfers, account consolidations, all the practical matters that needed to be handled. But there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. She wasn't sad or scared or grieving. She was efficient, businesslike, handling the situation like any other transaction. When I confronted her about it, asked if maybe she could at least pretend to be upset, she looked at me with contempt. "Someone has to handle the practical matters, Michael. Your father needs me to be strong, not fall apart like you." 2 weeks before he died, my dad asked to speak to me alone. Linda didn't like it, stood in the doorway of his bedroom looking suspicious, but he insisted, and she finally left, closing the door with more force than necessary. My dad took my hand, his grip so weak it barely registered, and looked at me with eyes that were suddenly more lucid than they'd been in weeks. "Michael," he whispered, his voice rough from the pain and the medication, "I need you to know something. I need you to know that I see it now. I see what she is, what she's been doing. I was such a fool." I felt tears running down my face because this was the conversation I'd wanted to have for years, the acknowledgement I'd needed, but it was coming too late when there was nothing left to fix. "Dad, don't worry about it now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just rest, just focus on—" But he squeezed my hand with surprising strength, cut me off. "No, listen. I changed my will, Michael. Last week, when she thought I was too out of it to understand what I was signing, but I got my old lawyer here, had him bring new documents. Everything is protected for you. The house, the business, the investments, it's all in a trust. She can't touch it." He was struggling to breathe, each word an effort, and I wanted to tell him to stop, to save his strength, but he was determined to finish. "She's going to try to tell you otherwise. She's going to produce some other will, some other document, but it's not real. Mine is filed with Harold Peterson downtown, dated and witnessed properly. Don't let her take what's yours. Don't let her win." I promised him I wouldn't, held his hand until he fell back asleep, and then sat there in the dark, wondering if what he'd told me was real or a morphine-induced fantasy. The next day, when I tried to mention it, he didn't remember the conversation, looked at me with confusion when I brought up lawyers or wills or trusts. Linda was in the room within seconds, asking what I was bothering him about. Why couldn't I just let him rest peacefully? I tried to call Harold Peterson, but the office said he was on vacation, wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. I tried to push it, explain the urgency, but without specifics, without details I didn't have, they wouldn't help me. My dad died 3 days later, never regaining the clarity he'd had during our conversation, and I was left wondering if he'd really changed his will, or if I'd just imagined the hope in his voice. At the funeral, when Linda made her announcement, when she publicly disinherited me in front of everyone my father had ever known, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe my dad had left everything to her. Maybe I'd invented that late-night conversation because I wanted so badly for him to see the truth. I questioned my own memory, my own sanity, standing there beside his casket while his widow explained to a chapel full of people that I'd been cut out. And the next morning, when she threw me out, when she looked at me with those triumphant eyes and told me I had 4 hours to pack my life into boxes, I was almost ready to accept it. almost ready to walk away and let her have everything. Because what was the point of fighting when I didn't even know what I was fighting for, but something in me wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was the memory of my dad's face when he told me he'd changed his will, the clarity in his eyes, the urgency in his voice. Maybe it was 16 years of watching Linda manipulate and control and destroy, and knowing that if I walked away now, she'd have gotten away with all of it. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, the part of me that refused to let her win completely. I moved into Aunt Karen's guest room and I started digging. I called Harold Peterson's office every day until he got back from vacation. Finally reached him 2 weeks after the funeral. "Mr. Peterson," I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Michael Harrison, Tom Harrison's son. I need to know if my father filed a new will with you about 3 weeks ago." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then Harold Peterson cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, professional. "Michael, I need you to come to my office. Can you be here this afternoon?" I drove downtown immediately, my heart pounding, because that response meant something, meant my dad hadn't been delusional, meant there was something to find. Peterson's office was in an old building downtown, wood-paneled walls and leather chairs, the kind of place that screamed old money and discretion. He ushered me in personally, closed the door, and pulled out a file that looked too thin to contain anything important. "Your father did come to see me," he said, opening the file carefully. 3 weeks before he passed. He was very clear about what he wanted, despite being obviously ill. He executed a new will, properly witnessed, revoking all previous wills. I felt something surge in my chest, a mixture of vindication and grief and rage. "Linda said she had his will," I told Peterson. "She read it the day after he died. Said he left everything to her except some token amount for me." Peterson's expression darkened, his professional mask slipping for just a moment. "Then she's either mistaken or lying. Your father's will leaves the bulk of his estate to you, Michael. The house, the business, the investment accounts, all of it goes into a trust with you as the primary beneficiary. Your stepmother receives a fixed sum, $50,000, and nothing more. He was very specific about that." He slid the document across the desk, and I saw my father's signature at the bottom, shaky but unmistakable, witnessed by Peterson and his paralegal. "And this is the only valid will. It was properly executed and filed. Any other document Linda has produced is either outdated or fraudulent." The next part happened fast, faster than I expected. Peterson filed paperwork with the probate court, produced the real will, and suddenly Linda's carefully constructed lie fell apart. She'd been operating on an old will, one from 5 years earlier that did leave everything to her, and she'd either genuinely believed it was current or she'd known about the new one and chose to ignore it. The court froze all the assets while they investigated, which meant Linda couldn't sell the house or liquidate the accounts or do anything with property that legally belonged to me. She was furious, showed up at Aunt Karen's house screaming about fraud and manipulation, claiming I'd coerced my dying father into changing his will. But there were witnesses, documentation, medical records showing my dad had been lucid when he signed the documents, and her accusations went nowhere. The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of lawyers and depositions and court appearances where Linda tried every trick she knew to maintain control. She claimed undue influence, said Peterson had manipulated my father, accused me of elder abuse, threw every legal theory at the wall hoping something would stick. But the truth was simple and documented. My father had changed his will because he'd finally seen what she was, and he'd wanted to protect his son from her. The court ruled in my favor, validated the new will, and suddenly everything changed. The house, the business, the investment accounts, it was all mine. Linda got her $50,000 and nothing else, and the look on her face when the judge read the ruling was worth every moment of uncertainty I'd endured. But here's the thing about justice, the thing I learned through all of this. It's not really about revenge or vindication or even getting back what's yours. It's about truth winning over lies, about manipulation and cruelty finally having consequences. When I took possession of my father's estate, when I walked back into the house I'd grown up in and found that Linda had already moved out, taken everything she could carry and left the rest, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. Sad for my dad, who'd spent years of his life with someone who'd never really loved him, who'd seen him as a means to an end. Sad for myself, for all the years I'd watched this happen and couldn't stop it. Sad for Linda, even because what kind of person spends 16 years playing a long game of manipulation just to end up with nothing? I sold my father's business to his longtime partner for a fair price, invested the money conservatively. I kept the house, but I renovated it completely, erasing every trace of Linda's aesthetic and bringing back some of my mom's touches that I'd saved. I found the college fund that Linda had absorbed into their joint accounts, recovered most of it through the estate settlement, and used part of it to establish a scholarship in my mom's name at my old high school. The rest I put towards starting a small non-profit that helps families navigate elder care and spot signs of financial exploitation, because I learned through this experience that my dad wasn't the only one who'd fallen victim to someone like Linda. There are thousands of people out there who find themselves isolated and manipulated by the people they should be able to trust most. I ran into Linda about a year after everything was settled. She was working as an event coordinator again, back to what she'd been doing before she met my dad, and she looked smaller somehow, diminished. We were at the same coffee shop downtown, and she saw me before I saw her. Could have left without saying anything, but she walked over to my table instead. "I hope you're happy," she said, not sitting down, not even attempting civility. "You got everything you wanted." I looked up at her. This woman who'd made so much of my life miserable, who'd isolated my father from his family, who'd tried to steal everything he'd worked for. And I realized I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity anymore. I got what my father wanted me to have. I corrected her gently. "That's not the same thing." She opened her mouth to argue, to launch into whatever justification she'd constructed in her mind. But I held up my hand. "Linda, I don't want to do this. I don't want to rehash everything or try to make you understand why what you did was wrong. You made your choices, and they had consequences, and that's all there is to it. I hope you find whatever you're looking for. I genuinely do, but I can't have you in my life in any capacity. We're done." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw emotions flickering across her face too fast to identify, and then she turned and walked out without another word. I haven't seen her since. Don't know what happened to her. Don't particularly care. She's a closed chapter in a book I'm ready to move past. These days, I think a lot about my dad, about the things he taught me before Linda came into our lives, and the final lesson he taught me at the very end. He wasn't perfect, made huge mistakes in trusting the wrong person and ignoring warning signs that should have been obvious. But at the end, when it mattered most, he saw the truth and he acted on it. He protected me even when he was dying, even when it would have been easier to just accept Linda's version of reality and let things play out however they would. That took courage, took clarity, took love that was stronger than manipulation. And he taught me that it's never too late to make things right, never too late to stand up for what matters, even if you're doing it from a hospital bed with weeks left to live. I still live in the house I grew up in, the house my parents bought together when I was 5, the house that Linda tried to take from me. Every room has been reclaimed, filled with memories of my real family, photographs of my mom and dad, artwork and furniture and touches that reflect who we actually were. I have dinner with Aunt Karen and Uncle Jim at least once a week, have rebuilt the family connections that Linda tried so hard to sever. I'm dating someone now, a woman named Emma who works at the non-profit with me, who understands about complicated families and difficult pasts and the importance of choosing the right people to let into your life. And I'm careful, maybe too careful, about watching for red flags, about making sure the people I trust are worthy of that trust. The lawsuit settlement and estate included all of Linda's financial manipulations over the years, including my mother's college fund that she'd convinced my dad to redirect. I recovered not just the original $50,000, but 16 years of growth and interest, which ended up being close to $200,000. I could have kept it, used it for myself, but instead I've funded 23 scholarships so far, helping kids whose families can't afford to send them to the schools they deserve. Every scholarship recipient gets a packet that includes a photo of my mom, because I want them to know who they're honoring, want them to understand that education was important to her, that she would have loved knowing her memory was helping others achieve their dreams. So when people ask me about what happened, about how my stepmother tried to disinherit me at my father's funeral and kick me out the next day, I tell them the whole story. I don't sugarcoat it or make it easier than it was. I talk about the years of manipulation, the isolation, the small cruelties that added up to something monstrous, but I also talk about my father's final act of love, about how he found the strength to see the truth and protect me even when he was dying. I talk about the importance of family, real family who shows up when things are hard, like Aunt Karen did. And I talk about how justice isn't always immediate or obvious, but it's worth fighting for, worth enduring the uncertainty and the struggle to make sure truth wins over lies. My father died believing he'd failed to protect me, believing he'd let Linda isolate us and destroy what we had. But his final decision, his last act of clarity and love, it changed everything. It gave me back not just the material things Linda tried to steal, but something more important, the knowledge that my dad saw me, valued me, loved me enough to make things right, even when it cost him everything. That's worth more than any house or business or investment account. That's the real inheritance, the one that matters, the one that Linda could never take away no matter how hard she tried. And that's what I hold on to. What keeps me grounded when I think about everything that happened. My father loved me, protected me, chose me over her in the end. That's what she deserves to know, what she'll have to live with. She lost, not because I beat her, but because love beat manipulation, truth beat lies, and family beat greed. That's real justice, and it's more satisfying than any revenge could ever be.